The Australian Financial Review.
It was the most public of breakups.
This is an 80-year coalition agreement now over. The Nationals leader emerging out of this meeting this morning here in Canberra, walking away from lengthy negotiations with the Liberals.
Nationals leader David Littleproud was to the point.
We're doing it because we damn well believe in it. And I would have thought that's important.
New Liberal Party leader Sussan Ley was still hopeful.
Our door remains open. And we look forward with optimism to rejoining at some point in the future.
But former Prime Minister John Howard had a warning.
If the two parties remain separate for too long, away from a coalition, then the differences on policy will harden and it will be more difficult to resolve them.
The coalition implosion has delivered a hammer blow to any chance of a quick recovery for Conservative politics after an election landslide that entrenched Labor in power.
It is completely different down here to now Monday. The landscape now is unrecognisable. What we thought on Monday, that world no longer exists. It's like someone dropped an atom bomb. Welcome
to The Fin. I'm Lisa Murray. Today, political editor Phillip Coorey and former Labor advisor and AFR columnist Lidija Ivanovski on the decimation of the opposition, the uphill battle facing Sussan Ley and the fierce debate over the super tax. It's Thursday, May 22. Hi Lydia, hi Phil. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
No worries, Lisa.
Thanks, Lisa. G'day, Phil.
Lid.
It's been a huge few weeks in politics. We have new leadership teams, a new cabinet and some unhappy former ministers. But the biggest news was the coalition split. So we're going to get to all of that. But just briefly, Phil, Anthony Albanese is back from his first overseas trip since winning the election. How did he go?
Oh, he did fine, Lisa. I mean, it's always, you don't win points for doing well overseas, you just lose them for messing up. But no, he's a seasoned professional now. I was contrasting it to 3 years ago after he won the election. And you may or may not remember, he had to go straight overseas within 36 hours of winning the election to attend the Quad Security Dialogue meeting in Japan. And him and Penny Wong got sworn in and they raced to the plane and, we're in Tokyo. And he didn't know what was going on. He was still getting used to the idea as Prime Minister, let alone standing there with the President of the United States and the Japanese and Indian leaders. And I remember he did this press conference and he was shaking so much. We sort of had a bit of a pact on the trip not to make life too hard for him because the message he needed to send to the region about continuity and so forth. But you look at him now and he's done a dozen trips in between. And the trip began with a couple of days in Jakarta where they had the usual sort of warm and fluffy affirmation of the relationship, this time with Prabowo Subianto, the president there. He breezed through it.
This is a bloke that looked very comfortable on the world stage. The pics we saw of him prancing around Rome wearing his Ray-Bans, this looked like a guy who knows he's pretty secure in his job for a while to come. And it's just such a contrast from what we saw in his first term.
So the Prime Minister after Jakarta went straight to Rome for the Pope's inaugural Mass.
Anthony Albanese has enjoyed his second meeting with Pope Leo in 2 days.
And during his stay in Rome, he met Pope Leo, had a personal chat to him.
The new pontiff was presented with an Indigenous artwork and formally invited to Sydney for a major Catholic conference to be held in 2028.
Amongst those people he met was the new Canadian Prime Minister, Mark Carney, who was elected on April 28, just a few days before, a week or so before Albanese.
The Prime Minister has promised Ukraine's President, Volodymyr Zelensky, that Australia will continue to provide it with military support.
And he also had a sit-down with Volodymyr Zelensky as well, the Ukrainian President, and those tanks that we promised the Ukrainians, oh goodness me, about a year ago, he said, they're coming, checks in the mail.
Volodymyr Zelensky grateful for promised Abrams tanks from Australia, but keen to smother Moscow's economic ability too.
More pressure, more sanctions on Russia.
I think the only thing out of the trip is we were expecting a one-on-one with either JD Vance or Trump. Trump didn't go, so we were under the impression he was going to sit down with Vance, but that didn't happen either. So we'll wait now till this time next month when we'll all be in Canada at the G7 and potentially at the White House, and we'll have to wait for the big meeting then.
Okay, it's fair to say the whole country was left reeling from this month's election result, and none more so than those in the Liberal and National parties. Phil, the coalition has not survived. What do you make of the breakup, and do you think they'll get back together?
Oh, two very big questions, Lisa, and I don't think anyone's quite sure what to make of the breakup. It was a big moment because it hasn't happened for nearly 50 years. I mean, the Nats and the Libs have been effectively in coalition for more than 80 years, and they split up once in 1972 to 74, the first term of the Whitlam government, and the last time was the Joe for Canberra madness back in 1987. So it's a massive thing in terms of the shake-up of politics and what it's done to conservative politics. And I think, we're talking about the Prime Minister, having a fairly good week overseas. I think he'd be tempted to, could have done another lap of the globe. There's no need for him to get home in a hurry because this is going to play out for a while. What do we make of it? Well, what it means is we effectively now have no opposition. The Liberal Party is, in fact, the opposition now because they're the next biggest non-government party, but there's only like 28 of them in the lower house and about 26 in the Senate, and they will form the entire ministry. And, clearly, Lisa, they can't neither the Nationals or the Liberals can govern in their own right ever. That's why they've been in coalition for so long. So it's not a sustainable position. And as John Howard said, and everyone else has said, the longer they stay apart, the further they'll grow apart and the harder their differences will become to reconcile. So when will they get back together? No idea. Necessity, I suspect, will force them back together at some stage, but there'll be a lot of compromise. The theory is that they've listed these 4 policy reasons why they wanted to split. I think the deeper theory is that Littleproud's probably worried about his leadership because he got a scare last week when Matt Canavan challenged, and it's a bit of an overreaction to sort of shore up your leadership. But he listed 4 policies that the Nationals refused to give up. Nuclear power, this $20 billion regional fund they announced during the election, service obligations to ensure there's proper mobile and internet coverage in the bush. And the 4th one was the powers to forcibly divest supermarkets for anti-competitive conduct. Now, Sussan Ley didn't say no to those, but she said the 2 things. When you form a coalition agreement, it doesn't usually get into the specifics of policy. It's more about who will have what front bench positions, and there might be a bit of a broad sort of policy direction there, but it doesn't get down into the tin tacks. And Littleproud said, well, these are the 4 things we won in the last government, and we got adopted as coalition policy, and we want you to lock those in as part of the coalition agreement. And she said, look, we've just been destroyed. The Liberals have now lost 35 seats over the last 2 elections. We're going to wipe the slate clean and have a review of everything. So she wasn't saying no, and nor was she saying yes to those policies. She was saying, I can't give you an answer now. We have to go through our process. And look, it's a fair point. Given they weren't going to be back in power anyhow for about 6 years, I don't see what difference a couple of weeks would have made. So there was this sort of rude haste, if you like, by the Nationals, and that's why the suspicion is that, maybe Littleproud was worried about his own back. So that's why it split up. That does have its advantages for the Liberal Party because Ley has said from the outset she needs to drive the Liberal Party back to the centre. It needs to respect the wishes of the voters who have thrown the Liberal Party out of virtually every city and suburban seat in the country. And it was always going to be a lot harder to do that while you're chained to the likes of Matt Canavan. So they will now be able to get back to a much more centrist policy agenda, especially on things like climate change, environment, traditional economic values, stuff like that. Dare I say it, a more teal approach. I wouldn't be surprised if some stage down the track they don't reach out to some of the teals, the more liberal-leaning teals like Allegra Spender, as part of this process. And on the other side, the Nats will go further their way, and so when it does come time to reconcile, it might be a bit more difficult than it is now. I mean, healthy in the short term, but I still see in the longer term it will be difficult to reconcile at the end.
And Phil, the breakup of the coalition overshadowed the other big news for the opposition, and that was Sussan Ley becoming the first female leader of the Liberal Party in 81 years. What sort of leader will she be?
She's an interesting cat. She's been in Parliament 24 years.
May I remind the House that this is the Honourable Member's first speech and ask the House to extend to her the usual courtesies. The Honourable Member.
She's got a very probably one of the more interesting backgrounds of anyone in this place in terms of her life.
For me, this is a moment in time to capture and to treasure, and I am conscious of the great responsibility I have to represent here all of the people of Farrer.
Born in Africa, British parents, came here as a teenager, bit of a hippie chick, travelled around Australia in a combi van as a single woman, which, you didn't do a lot in those days.
After leaving high school, I trained as a pilot. In those days, there were very few jobs for female commercial pilots, and I worked as an air traffic controller in Sydney.
Worked in shearing sheds, got a pilot's licence, mustered sheep from an aeroplane, and
I found work aerial stock mustering for a shearing contractor, and it was then that I began to learn about rural Australia.
she's done a lot, and I think if you can hold your own in a shearing shed, you can probably hold your own as a woman in a political caucus, so she's got the tough skills. But I reckon if you ask most Australians, they wouldn't be able to tell you two things about her.
Sussan's certainly an interesting person. I don't think anyone expects Sussan Ley to be the next Prime Minister except maybe Sussan Ley.
I am humbled, I am honoured, and I am up for the job.
It's going to be a tall order for her just to make it to the next election as opposition leader.
The Liberal Party has met and we have determined that the new leader of our Liberal Party is Sussan Ley, with 29 votes, and Angus Taylor.
An interesting thing here is she beat Taylor 29-25, but at least 3 of her votes are from senators who are leaving at the end of June. So it's not a party room that's united behind her.
And she's got as her deputy the inimitable Ted O'Brien. The guy does have a bit of substance. He'll be important foil to Lee. He'll be important in terms of the Chinese community. He does speak fluent Mandarin. They were using him a lot in the campaign to go to seats with a lot of Chinese voters, but they've got an impossible task ahead of them, so we'll see.
Yeah. What I think is going to be interesting is whether Angus Taylor in the coming months is the alternative to her leadership, or if his star fades even further. I mean, it says a lot that his own colleagues didn't want to give the leadership to the person in charge of their economic strategy for the past 3 years, and a joint ticket going into his leadership tilt with Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price, who during the campaign took on this very Trumpian role, showed his judgment is just well off the party, well off where the party room needs to be.
Lee wasn't the only woman to take the helm of a political party last week. We saw Larissa Waters chosen to be leader of the Greens. They too will have to rebuild. What do you think her leadership means for that party?
She's pretty smart. She sort of got the leadership by default, Lisa, because she's the only one in the party everyone likes. Like, there's only 12 of them, but there's a bit of hate in there and a lot of rivalry. And I would have thought the obvious choice based on sort of presence and ability would have been Sarah Hanson-Young, but half the party doesn't like Sarah and half the party doesn't like Maureen Freaky, who was the other candidate. So Larissa Waters was very much a consensus candidate. Everyone likes her. She's fairly innocuous. She's smart. She's an environmental lawyer. But they got pantsed at the election. They were sent a very clear message, the same way the coalition was sent a very clear message about playing on the extremes. So her job will be to find that balance again, and because she's an environmentalist, go up the middle again and do social equity without screaming at people.
But they did retain their 11 seats in the Senate, so they have more influence outright.
100%, and that's why they're still very powerful. I think they had 6 spots up and they won them all back. So they now have that balance of power. But the reason they have the balance of power, Lisa, is because Labor got more Senate seats, right? The Greens didn't improve. Labor went from 25, maybe as high as 30, we don't know yet. So that's why they no longer need David Pocock and Jackie Lambie and Tammy Tyrrell and anyone else. Labor can do it with the Greens.
So, Lydia, with more than 90 seats and an opposition in disarray, the Labor Party's power is entrenched, to say the least. It's in control of both the House and effectively the Senate. How will that change the way they operate in Albanese's second term?
I think the Prime Minister and Tony Burke, as the leader of government business, will absolutely tear shreds off the opposition. They both love Parliament. They both love the theatrics of it. And they feed off each other's energy. And when you're looking at 90-plus seats on one side of the House, it's going to be a bullpit. There's obviously plenty of upside of having such a commanding majority, but this is politics, and as Phil and listeners know, things can go very wrong very quickly. And in the modern world, voters aren't afraid of turning against governments quickly. Albanese and his team have to be wary of any look of hubris or arrogance. The key thing for them is to just focus on what they were elected for, and that's getting on with the job. People want politics out of their way. They want to focus on their footy team playing at night. They want their garbage picked up, and they want to know that, their jobs are secure. So I think there's a really clear message from the electorate that they're not interested in a really loud voice from Canberra. They're just interested in a government getting on with it. And while the Greens do have the balance of power, I think Phil is spot on. Anthony will actually turn it into a virtue of not cutting deals with them for the message it sends to the broader public.
Yeah. This government now has the easiest Senate since 20 years ago. So from 2007 onwards, after Kevin Rudd won, the Senate's become a bit of a madhouse. Rudd in 2007, until they knocked him off in 2010, needed Steve Fielding and Nick Xenophon and the Greens, and that was a very difficult troika to satisfy, and it's been pretty unwieldy ever since. What we've seen now is a return to the old days where, because Labor has expanded its numbers, it's just Labor and the Greens. Every time Labor's opposed by the opposition, the Liberal Party, it just needs the Greens. It doesn't need David Pocock or Tammy Tyrrell or Lydia Thorpe or Fatima Payman or Jackie Lambie or any of the rest of them that it needed last term when it needed the Greens +3. It just needs the Greens, because between them now they'll have the 39 requisite votes to pass bills. That's very significant because A, the Greens are usually in lockstep with Labor anyhow in the Senate, and B, I suspect, at least in the short term, they'll be even more compliant this time because of the hiding they were given at the last election, and that their new leader, Larissa Ward, has promised to be more constructive. So it's going to be a pretty easy Senate. Yeah, I think the only problem is that the government doesn't have a lot to do. They didn't take much to the last election. They're probably wishing they took a bit more now, because apart from the superannuation tax and the eradication of student debt, which everyone's going to pass, there's not much more for them to get through at the moment.
But they did start the term, after such an emphatic victory with a factional brawl. Do you think that will have any lingering effects on the public perception of Labor and how they govern?
I think certainly it's taken a bit of gloss off the victory. We saw Mark Dreyfus, KC, formerly the Attorney General, a role he's served in government and opposition since 2007, a very well-respected figure across the board, a prominent Jewish figure in Victoria, make way for a young up-and-coming Labor right member, Sam Ray. That's obviously left a bit of a sour taste in people's mouths because that was unexpected. Mark is getting towards the end of his career. Whether or not he would have gone around again had he known that what was in store for him is a question that I think people are wondering. But I think it's testament to Mark that he turned up to the caucus, the first caucus meeting, and he was very gracious. He was smiling. There was no sign of what had happened, the political kind of assassination that had been done. Sharp contrast to Ed Husick, the former Industry and Innovation Minister, who also lost his seat because of the numbers in New South Wales, who decided to not turn up to the caucus meeting and go to, I think, a local gym in Canberra and post Instagram photos of him pumping iron. So two contrasting responses there to a pretty ugly episode, but one that is not new to the Labor Party. If there's one thing they're pretty good at is attacking and savaging their own.
One of the things we've got to get our heads around here, Lisa, is the weirdness of the election result. Labor, as I speak to you, is sitting on about 94 seats, the Liberals on around 28 and the Nationals on 15. The 76 is the magic number. It's impossible for the Liberal Party to win the next election, even if they do rescue the coalition before them. There's no precedent. If they did rescue the coalition, in 1996, the Howard government landslide against Keating, Howard picked up 29 seats, which is a record. And then in the next election in 1998, Howard lost 14 seats to hold on by 5. In 2028, Labor could ostensibly lose almost 20 seats and still either be just in majority or just in a small minority. So effectively, Labor is its own opposition for the next 3 years. The two most likely outcomes in 2028 is a Labor majority or a Labor minority, unless they really blow it. But look, even before the coalition split, it was difficult. I now can't see any circumstance where either of those coalition parties on their own could even come close to forming opposition at the next election. So, yeah, if they don't reconcile, the government is definitely in power until 2031.
We're talking about the political fallout from the election result and what Labor might do with its resounding election win. The first test for the new government will most likely be the super tax. While Labor now has the numbers to get the legislation passed, there's been some heated debate over the policy, including criticism from former Prime Minister Paul Keating. Phil, can you explain what the super tax legislation is, and do you expect it to become a problem for the government?
So basically, if you've got more than $3 million in your super account, then they will tax the earnings on the component of that account over $3 million. So let's say you got $4 million, so the earnings on that extra $1 million by 30% rather than the current 15%. So they're doubling the tax on the earnings of the component over $3 million. Now that's sort of all well and good if you're, Percy Punter with your industry super fund with $4 million in it. But where it's running into problems is it really hits SMSFs, self-managed super funds. People with assets in their super, properties, businesses, farms, shares, investment in venture, VC, venture capital investments, startup investments. These are going to be unrealised gains that are going to be taxed. So if you've got your farm, for example, and the value of the farm goes up, then you're going to pay 30% of that increase in value as tax to the government, but you're not actually cashing in on that. They're taxing the unrealised gains. And this doesn't happen in the tax system. This is a principle that's being violated. It doesn't happen in the super system now. It's a really big step to take. You can only argue that, Labor says they want the revenue, but you can only also argue that they want to wipe out people, using SMSFs for investments, because that's what it will do. If you invest in some startup and the startup takes off, you're going to have to sell your shares to pay the tax unless you've got other means of doing it, or you're going to have to sell your investment property or your business or whatever. So that's the main problem with it, the violation of that principle. The other problem is Chalmers is refusing to index to inflation, that $3 million threshold. So when they say, it's only going to affect 80,000 people, don't worry about it, that's a load of rubbish. It will soon and very quickly start affecting a lot more people than that.
So, Lidija, they have got the numbers to get it through, but do you think this criticism and the backlash that we're seeing now might mean they moderate the policy at all?
I think Tim Wilson, he will be rubbing his hands together with glee, given that super is a particular interest area for him, and going after the big super funds, he's really created his profile out of doing that. So you could imagine that this would be the perfect thing for him to lob on a horse and ride through. I think it's out there now, the super tax. Whether or not they scale it back or not is a question for the Treasurer and the PM. But I don't think they're going to take massive political risks with this stuff. And I don't know if the unintended consequences are going to be big enough for the Treasurer to decide to scale it back.
And Phil, as you said, they do need the money. So do you think this is a sign of more to come? There might be other taxes on wealth?
Well, the PM is being very cautious, and he keeps saying we're not going to exceed our mandate, but they will be under a lot of pressure. And we know, in 2019 they did want to curb the use of trusts, and we know Treasury's really hot to trot on it. I would argue there's probably an off-the-shelf, proposal just waiting there should the Treasurer ask for it. So we'll see how brave they get this term. They may not do it this term, but they may take it to the next election. I think at a minimum we'll see that, based on the fact that they're probably going to win it.
Yeah, I reckon that's much more likely, particularly if they cop a fair bit of heat on the super reforms now. I think they will not want to take any more gloss off themselves, and they'll just get on and try and avoid too much fiddly changes and get on with actually fixing the things that they've got to fix, like the NDIS.
This is the problem. They can't get current policies and spending under control, and then they add more. We've got a Prime Minister promising free childcare for everyone by the end of the next term. It's a great idea, but by golly, it's going to cost a lot of money. It's one thing to raise taxes, but I think there's an onus on the government. If you're going to flog people with new taxes and come after wealth, then it's also on you to stop spending so much dough when the budget's in deficit. It's got to cut both ways, and I think if they just do one and not the other, it could soon, things could soon turn for them.
Lidija, with the numbers stacked against them, what can the Liberal Party do to win back support with voters, have some sort of influence in the Parliament, and be an effective opposition?
Look, I think at some point the government is going to stuff up and people will get pissed off at them. People weren't happy with the Albanese government 12 months ago or even 6 months ago, but Dutton's woeful judgment and performance let them back into the game. I always say you learn more from losing than winning, and it's true. Based on that, there should be some very wise Liberals now, and we'll see if Sussan's one of them. I think a couple of things they can do is make a bit of noise between now and Parliament first sitting in July. The Liberal Party need to pick their time and be patient. So I think just to take a bit of time and actually reset properly and get some of those fundamentals in the party room right. What is their position going to be when they get back to Parliament in July? They're going to have some of those basics settled. Otherwise, they're just offering themselves up as a kind of piñata for Labor.
There's no prospect now of anyone getting their policies straight in the opposition or the Liberal or National Party before Parliament resumes. I don't think there was when they were in coalition. There's even less of a prospect of that now, as Sussan Ley has put her foot down and has made very clear they are not going to be rushed on policy. In fact, she said on ABC's 7:30, the reason I've done this, not bowed to this demand, is because it's a sign I'm listening to the voters. We've been sent a message and we've got to go back to square one and rediscover ourselves. And that does mean there won't be any sort of hard and fast policy positions, within a month. This is going to be a long process.
And finally, what do you both expect from this government? Will Albanese overreach? Will there be any bold reforms, or will there be more of the same?
One of the things that worries me here, the frightening things with this coalition split, is an already ineffective opposition is going to be now utterly ineffective. And bad opposition leads to bad government. So, Anthony Albanese has always said already his feet are going to stay firmly on the ground. He's not going to get ahead of himself and doing anything silly. But I think, the temptation now to do a few things might even be greater now that he effectively faces no opposition. And that's not good for a democracy to have no opposition. So, trying to fix the budget, that's going to take real guts. That's their biggest challenge, is to get the budget under control. Remember, we're headed to a $42 billion deficit next year, which for all the ballyhoo during the campaign about the budget being in better nick than when Labor came into power, that's not the case. It's actually going to be in worse nick in terms of the size of the deficit and the proportion of GDP that deficit constitutes. And debt will be through $1 trillion by Christmas this year. So those things don't go away, Lisa, and that will be their anchor point. They have to get serious about it. If they don't, they're just delaying the reckoning, and they're going to have to do that while they're going to be prevailed upon by a lot of people to spend a lot more money. And to me, that's the sort of big test. At the same time, they've set a lot in train. They have to, the energy transition is a lot of work, and it's difficult and it's controversial. They have to monitor that. They've got to get the skills thing. And of course, the biggest problem facing this country is housing. A lot was said and promised and spent in that first term, and now it was a good idea, I think, to keep Claire O'Neill in that portfolio because she really wanted to keep it and get some things done and get some houses built. And, they've still got the immigration problem with people, there's a number of people coming in. So nothing's changed. All the problems that existed 6 weeks ago, 8 weeks ago are still there.
Victory's never sounded so depressing, Phil.
Sorry, mate, but, you got to get real.
And the other thing to think about is there's going to be a lot of cabinet ministers, a lot of new faces that all have ambition, all have grand plans, and will all have to work within the constraints of the Treasurer and the PM's balance sheet. And as Phil says, there's some repair work that needs to be done. And it's very, very hard to deliver on promises that you're going to make when there's not much cash going around and when you've got big, expensive items that you've already announced, like the housing plan, the NDIS, and other structural issues you need to fix. But I think the one point that we can all agree on is that Albo comes back to this term of government with commanding authority, and he will use that when it's required, and he will make sure to keep everyone reined in. And you can see that through the selection of people he's put into key roles where he can keep checks and balances on the broader cabinet and ministry.
Thanks, Phil. Thanks, Lidija.
No worries, Lisa.
Cheers, mate.
Thank you for listening to The Fin. I'm Lisa Murray, with political editor Phillip Coorey and Financial Review columnist and former Labor advisor Lidija Ivanovski joining the podcast today. The Fin is produced by Alex Gow, with thanks to Zach De Silva. Lap Fan is head of podcast. Fiona Buffini is head of premium content. Our theme is by Alex Gow. If you like the show and want to hear more, follow us wherever you get your podcasts and consider rating and reviewing us as it helps others find us. For more stories about markets, business and power, subscribe to the Financial Review at afr.com/subscribe. See you next week.
The Australian Financial Review.